Let us pray together. Be with us this morning, God. Quiet our hearts. May our spirits be still, that we might hear from you. Amen. When our story picks up in today's text from the book of Genesis, Jacob is several days, perhaps even several weeks, into a journey to Padan Aram. The journey he's on is somewhat of a rite of passage in this patriarchal culture that he lives in. It's a destination he's headed to based off his father's recommendation, where he is to go and find a wife. One particular thing to think about this morning is that the dream that we are going to read about is not the only significant thing that we have to consider when we think about Jacob's journey. Yes, it's a classic Old Testament passage, the passage of Jacob seeing a ladder stretching up to heaven and angels ascending and descending upon it. And it is a remarkable story, and I promise we will unpack it in due order. But first, in order to fully appreciate this story, it's imperative that we understand the context that the story is embedded in. And to understand that, we have to remember that at this point in the narrative, Jacob is partway through a journey. And it's a journey to an unfamiliar destination. And upon arrival to this unfamiliar destination, he will be responsible for finding a wife amid a culture of women he has never met. And finally, one of these unfamiliar women will be directly responsible for the way in which his legacy will be preserved. For in the ancient Near East, one's legacy depended upon the vastness of one's progeny. That's why the promise of generations filling the earth was so important in ancient cultures. It operated in much the same way that the notion of fame operates today. And so what we have to understand is that in order to fully appreciate this famous passage about Jacob's dream, we have to first understand that on this night when he has this dream, he is necessarily anxious. For again, he is partway through a journey into the unknown. And the outcome of this journey into the unknown will determine not only the quality of the life he'll live, but just as important in his mind, how and if he will be remembered after he's gone. So there's a lot riding on this trip for Jacob. And thus there's a lot going on in Jacob's mind the night he falls asleep and dreams his famous dream. And so now hold that thought and venture with me forward some 3,500 years from the ancient Near East to 19th century Denmark, to the little library where the young philosopher, theologian Søren Kierkegaard is now pioneering the theological and philosophical study of anxiety, ultimately defining anxiety as that about which there is no direct object. This in contrast to fear, Kierkegaard says. For fear, Kierkegaard says, has a direct object. One knows what one is afraid of. But anxiety, Kierkegaard says, is about that which one can't define. And anxiety arises, Kierkegaard says, in one species and one species alone, the human being. And here's why, according to Kierkegaard. Because unlike all other created species, we as human beings have the capacity to objectify time. That is, we as human beings are able to comprehend concepts such as past, present, and future. And because we are, and follow me here because here comes the main point, because we can objectify time, and because of another uniquely human ability, which is the ability to imagine, because of this, we are therefore able to project onto the future possibilities. Not know what will happen, but consider countless things that may happen. And follow me. It is this may, Kierkegaard claims, that gives rise to our anxiety, because we can't control that may. You follow that? As this awesome creature, Kierkegaard is saying, we as human beings are able to think about the future and weigh all our present decisions based off of all sorts of ideas of what may happen. This is an awesome power, exclusive to humankind. But because we don't have the even more awesome power of controlling what may happen, we are necessarily rendered anxious about the future. And that, Kierkegaard claims, is an inevitable part of being human. And that, of course, leads me to Walt Disney's Beauty and the Beast. There's no segue there. That is apropos of nothing. I had nothing to connect to that. I'm talking about the 1991 animated version here, not this newly released one. I'm talking about the original. April bought this movie for Ada and Juliana about 2 months ago now, and it immediately became one of the girls' favorites. I'd imagine we've watched that movie, 997 times since April first brought this home. I can quote it front to back. I can tell you all the reasons I detest Gaston. I can tell you all the reasons that I really do like the Beast. I can even argue passionately in defense of Belle's dad's sanity. The guy was a genius. The rest of the village just didn't quite understand the kind of foresight that this guy had. I digress. The reason I bring this movie up today, earlier this week, April was at an event, and I was at home by myself with the girls. And as usual, after utterly destroying the house, one of the girls suggested we turn on Beauty and the Beast. And so we did. And we all climbed up in April's and my bed, and we began watching the movie. And now, here's what it's necessary to know in order for this story to make any sense in view of our larger topic. I was anxious that night. In fact, I'd been anxious that whole day. Truth be told, I'd been anxious for the several weeks leading up to that day, because I had a big decision to make, and my deadline for making that decision was the next day. And so, as not to be cryptic about this, the decision was this: do I pursue a Doctor of Ministry degree now at Emory University, a school at which I'd been admitted and have been interested in attending, or do I put the pursuit off and perhaps revisit it sometime down the road? And now quickly, so as to be clear, this is a program that I would do online from here in Corbin. This wasn't a decision about leaving. Don't think you're getting rid of me that easily. That wasn't the decision. Now, this was just a decision about whether to pursue doctoral studies now from my office, or perhaps wait for later, or perhaps not do it at all. So as you can imagine, I'd spent the last several weeks, in fact, the last 6 months really, running the cost-benefit analysis. That is, was now the right time, or should I wait for later? Or should I do it at all? Because I don't have to do it. I don't need it. But I do want it, because I love school. And I do think I'll benefit from it, and thus I think will benefit from it. But does it make sense to do it now while the kids are young, or does it make more sense to do it later when they're older? And it's expensive now, but it'll be expensive later, and on and on and on. And for each point, I could argue it either way. And that was just the problem. for in Kierkegaard's terms, I could conceive of countless mays, things that might happen. But my inability to control those mays, that is, to foresee which may would become is, made the decision very scary. Now, I'd, of course, prayed about it. I'd prayed about it countless times. But I now realize this. Each of those prayers came in the form of an implicit request. Show me, God, what happens if I do this or don't do this. And so remained my prayer until Thursday night, as I lay in bed with my daughters and watched Beauty and the Beast for the 1000th time. For as the movie moved along, the girls eventually cuddled into me, and together we all three lay quietly watching this movie. And already a sense of fullness, a sense of rightness, a sense of this is where I want to be, a sense of right here in this moment is all that really matters. Already this deep and profound and important sense we sometimes get, already this sense had begun gathering in me. But then came the very end of the film, the closing scene where the beast, no longer cursed and now a prince again, dances in the ballroom of his castle with Belle, and family and friends and attendants watch them dance until finally the little boy Chip says, "Will they live happily ever after, Mama?" And his mother says, "Yes, of course, dear, of course." And then the theme song, Tale as Old as Time, crescendos and plays the film out as the credits begin to roll. And as that song crescendoed, Ada suddenly leapt off of me and onto the floor, and she gleefully and urgently held her hands out to me and said, "Dance with me, Daddy." And then Juliana, never to be outdone by her big sister, squirmed off of me and said, "Dance with me, Daddy." And so there on the floor of April's in my room, I held both of my little girls close to me at their request. And we spun around in circles, dancing to the rest of that beautiful song. As I held those two little girls to me, Emory University, and all the reasons either to go or not to go, this was the furthest thing from my mind. Because this moment, what was happening right now, was all that really mattered. And in that moment, a very particular awareness bubbled up in me in a way I've seldom experienced it before. Surely, I thought, as I held my two daughters, surely the Lord is in this place. And I didn't recognize it until now. Leading me back to Jacob, and to the journey Jacob was on, and to the anxiety he'd been feeling about what would come of it. That night, after tying up his donkey and having a small meal around the fire, Jacob found a rock and lay his head down upon it. And just as a side note, we've come a long way in sleep technology, hadn't we? What a bummer. So looking up at the stars, Jacob again began running through all the future possibilities, same ones he'd run through countless times before. Maybe I'll meet a wonderful woman. Maybe I won't. Maybe my future wife and I will have a good marriage. Maybe we won't. Maybe we'll have many sons and many daughters, make our father and our village proud. Maybe we won't. Maybe she and I will be remembered for many generations. Maybe we won't. And on and on and on. Yet again, he considered all the mays. And yet again, he suffered under the weight of his inability to control any of them. And so finally, anxious and afraid, he fell asleep. And then came the dream. And in the dream, he sees a ladder stretching from earth to heaven. And on that ladder, he sees angels ascending and descending. And then amid that vision, he suddenly feels God's presence right there with him. And here's God say, know that I am with you and that I will keep you wherever you go. And at that he awoke. And because of that vision, and because of that assurance, and because of that awareness, Jacob had been changed. And here is how he described the impetus for that change. Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not recognize it till now. It wasn't that Jacob suddenly knew exactly what would happen on the rest of his journey, and thus had no reason to remain anxious about the future possibilities. It was instead that he now had a much richer understanding that no matter what did happen, God would be right there with him the whole time. As surely as God's presence had been with him in that moment, so surely too would God's presence be with him in all future moments as well. Leading me back to Beauty and the Beast and my own anxiety about what to do about Emery. It's not that dancing with my daughters gave me some special insight into whether now was the right time to pursue doctoral studies. Not that there's some secret message encoded in the lyrics of Tale as Old as Time. It's instead that this was one of those moments, one of those rare and precious moments when completely unexpectedly I was blindsided by God's presence right there with me. It was a burning bush that began talking to me. It was a pillar of cloud leading the way. In other words, it was what theologians call a hierophany, which is just a big, fancy $5 word meaning the experience of God in the ordinary. Holding Ada and Juliana that night gave rise for me to a hierophany. Don't misunderstand. I didn't suddenly feel a sense of peace on what the right decision was. Instead, I suddenly felt a sense of peace that no matter what decision I made, God was with me now. And if with me now, then also with me then. And thus I saw the folly of all my earlier prayers on the subject. Rather than pray only for insight into what might happen, I'd failed to pray also to be present for what was happening now. And that was the chief insight Soren Kierkegaard had all those years ago, which is that when so often we are rendered anxious by our inability to control or know the future, the best medicine we have is to take account of what blessings we have now. We cannot change the past and we cannot control the future. But what we can control is the present. Not so much what happens in the present. We do have some degree of control over that, but not much. No, not so much what happens in the present, but whether or not we are in the present. And when we are in the present, Kierkegaard points out, our eyes can be opened to how surely God is in the present with us as well. Whether it's a vision of a ladder stretching up to heaven or an invitation to dance with our 2 young daughters. Whether it's a burning bush or simply a burning sunset. Whether it's a pillar of cloud pointing the way or simply a call from an old friend saying, I've missed you. Sure is good to hear from you. These are hierophanies, experiences of God in the ordinary, and these hierophanies are everywhere. All day, every day, ladders are stretching up to the heavens. If only we'll have eyes to see them. Know that I am with you and that I will keep you wherever you go. This is what God tells Jacob in response to this, his vision. For Jacob, that was promise enough to continue his journey forward. And for me, it is certainly promise enough to embark on doctoral studies at Emory. Mired in the human condition of not knowing what might happen tomorrow, let us take from this classic story the blessed assurance that God is with us today. Not just with us in some abstract, metaphorical way, but tangibly and practically and literally with us in this very moment. Look at the faces of the people in this room. These beloved faces with whom we come together to worship God week in and week out. Think of all the stories that bind us one to another. Think of, in some cases, how many generations some of these stories stretch across. Think of how deeply connected we are one to another, whether we've known one another for 7 months or 70 years. Think of that interconnectedness. Do you feel that richness? Do you feel that substance? Do you feel that buoyancy? Surely the presence of the Lord is in this place. And in the face of an always uncertain tomorrow, what comfort and joy there is in knowing that today. Amen.